Great. I think let's make a start now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this SEN webinar on what the voters really want to see from the parties on the environment. My name is Sam Hall. I'm the director of the Conservative Environment Network. We're very shortly going to hear from two expert speakers and to talk through what the polling and what the message testing says on this question. And then there'll be a chance for you all to put your questions to the speakers. So please do be thinking of what questions you'd like to ask, and please post them in the chat box below, and I will group them together and put them to the speakers. But before introducing our first speaker, I just want to briefly kind of set the scene and why we're doing this webinar. So the environment hasn't been a major feature so far in this election campaign. We've had a few pledges from the parties around issues such as sewage, Labour, for example, on setting up a state-owned energy company, GB Energy, and there's been debate as well around new oil and gas licences being issued in Scotland. But I think underlying lots of the major themes of the campaign, we have seen a strong focus on environmental issues and things like energy bills, which obviously have been pushed up very recently by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, economic growth, which has been stagnant, where green industries potentially offer opportunities for new investment and acceleration of levelling up. And of course, the debate around housing as well, and how that intersects with protecting green spaces and building homes to a more environmentally friendly standard. We have seen a lot of polling, however, in this campaign, and I'm delighted that we're going to hear yet more of it from Nick Partington, who joins us from CT Group, who's done some polling with SEN and Renewable UK, looking at the Conservatives 2019 voter coalition. He's going to talk us through some of that. We are then going to hear from Namira Hamid from Climate Outreach on some of the messaging that we've heard from about climate during the course of the campaign. I think generally speaking, it's fair to say that the Conservatives have adopted quite a negative tone around climate change, focusing on their opposition to various Labour climate policies. But is this what voters really want to hear? And is this the best way to both maximise your support from voters and indeed build support for the kind of ambitious environmental policies that we know we're going to need if we're going to tackle these problems? So without further ado, I will bring in Nick to kick things off.
Thanks so much, Sam. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to share my screen and run you through a few charts. So what we did along with SEN and, as Sam says, Renewable UK, is we ran two sets of focus groups, two in Darlington and two in Bournemouth, and then ran a poll of 2019 Conservative voters. So essentially what we were trying to get at was looking at the sort of perhaps full addressable market of Tory voters, and actually what do they care about? What do they want to hear from the party on climate? Because ultimately we've got lots of different interest groups pulling the direction of the party's messaging and indeed policies on climate in a lot of different directions. But kind of what did this actually mean for voters? What do people actually focus on? And I suppose if you were to take 2 points away from this, it's that ultimately climate's quite a low salience issue for people, but that obscures the extent to which it's an asymmetrically felt issue on lots of dimensions. So whether that's local versus national, or in terms of particular attitudes towards things like net zero, which are shared by a very small part of the voting coalition. So I'm going to run through these slides really quickly. I've been told I have 5 minutes, and so I will do my utmost to stick to that. So here's the broad overview of what the Conservative vote's looking like. So we did this research a little bit earlier in the year, but it's kind of prescient to what we've seen in the election campaign. We've got about half of Conservatives in 2019 saying they're still going to vote for the party, but then these big groups who are splitting away in sort of two directions, Reform and Labour. And to some extent, marshalling those two different leakages is a very important thing for strategists in the election. So the kind of framing point is that ultimately climate change is not a very important issue for lots of Conservative voters. They care about particular things, whether that's a general concern about waste of, for instance, plastic packaging, or they might care about energy security. They might care a great deal about the cleanliness of their rivers and wanting to do the right thing for the environment in general, but they broadly don't see it as being in the top rank of issues in comparison to these things that we've run here. So here is broadly what people say, how likely they are to support the government increasing investment in the following. So we've got the NHS, we've got crime, we've got defence, and then climate change at the bottom there. And we can see that that starts quite low and then falls off if we introduce the idea that it might cost them any money. So when people are forced to make the trade-offs, and if things are framed in terms of a trade-off, then support is quite low. But this kind of obscures the extent to which there are quite different views within this 2019 voting coalition. So if we see these two groups emerging, Labour switchers and Reform switchers, which has kind of been much of the conversation around the election at the moment, they have quite sharply divergent views on the environment. So these Labour switchers really do quite care about the environment. So the question we asked is basically how important the impact on the environment is on the decisions that people make day to day. For Reform voters, it's just not that important, kind of middling, but for Labour switchers, it really is a key part of the way in which they make decisions. Kind of unsurprisingly, if climate's not the issue for Reform voters, it's immigration, and it really can't be overstated the extent to which it's a sort of single issue opinion landscape for them. This is based on a question where we completely unprompted ask people what the most important issue that's going to be determining their vote is going to be. And we can see lots of competing issues like the NHS, cost of living, but for Reform switchers, you can see in that gorgeous lavender colour, there is just nothing like immigration. It's the only thing they care about. This is meaningful in a few directions, and we'll kind of come back to it, but it's very, very important to say that the party has quite a split view in terms of how its reputation brand has been on tackling climate change. So those who aren't voting for the party are more likely to say, actually, the Conservatives aren't serious and haven't been serious over the last 14 years in actually tackling climate change. It's something that's quite important to them. Whereas the people who stick with it, who are sticking with the party, are unsurprisingly enthusiastic. Looking to the issue of net zero, something that probably doesn't come as a surprise to people here is that stated understanding of net zero is really low. People kind of don't know what net zero means. It's a term that gets thrown around quite a lot, but it's actually not a term or a message that is really, really meaningful to people. And the kinds of term that really matter to people's understanding of the energy crisis, the energy transition, are going to be much more towards the basics: fossil fuels, renewable energy, energy security even is better understood than net zero. So worth thinking about. Net zero, again, we see a lot of divergence by voting intention. Essentially, there's really broad-based support apart from that slice within conservative voters who are now voting for reform, who are quite opposed. But this point that I think is really important, the asymmetry of the importance of climate policy. So what we've seen is that Reform switchers really only care about one thing, which is immigration. And ultimately, when we ask them here, how important each of the following issues is going to be in deciding how they vote, they pretty overwhelmingly say that climate is not going to be that important. Net zero is not going to be that important to how they're going to make their decisions. And that means kind of in both directions. They're not going to be motivated by a party that says that they're anti-net zero if their immigration policy isn't right, because they basically have this key focus. However, people who say they're going to vote for the Labour Party are extremely motivated. So they say it's very important to them. It's part of the kind of policy mix that is going to be convincing them to vote Labour or Conservative or for any other party. What What we do see, however, is if you do want to motivate people, energy security is quite a widely held ambition. People have felt a lot of pain in getting bill rises. They feel that it's a real issue and a geopolitical one, which is genuinely very important to them. It makes the issue quite concrete and something that actually matters to their lives. Just as a final point, we tested some manifesto ideas. So what we kind of wanted to see was how people reacted to various different ways of framing it. So number one there is a sort of a Labour idea, investing in renewables. Number two is something not dissimilar to something that the party would have said in the last year or so, more about pragmatism. Three is about scrapping net zero entirely, and four is a sort of harkening back to what we might have seen in 2019. What we saw is that actually the Conservatives voting coalition is overwhelmingly supportive of this backing of net zero, but kind of almost tempered by language around pragmatism, proportionality, and realism. So it's seen as a laudable goal, but people are concerned about reaching it and the impact that it's going to have on them. So ultimately, the conclusion that I would take from our research, and this is a very short run through, is that you're not going to win any more voters by going anti-net zero. It's just not a motivating issue for many people. What is a motivating issue for all is energy security, making sure that people have energy when the lights are going to come on, and making sure that it's not going to cost them an arm and a leg. And that messaging which acknowledges the challenges that net zero might face to people, but still backs it, is going to be the most effective way of doing it. Yeah, that's my piece, and I'll stop sharing.
Great. Many thanks, Nick, for that overview of the research, which yeah, it was very very interesting. I'd now like to bring in Namira from Climate Outreach, and I should say Climate Outreach are a charity doing work on climate communication. So yeah, hand over to you, Namira.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. So at Climate Outreach, we work on getting the climate story right. And right now we've produced 2 guides in the lead up to the general elections that would help anyone who's out there campaigning, in whichever capacity as volunteers or as in whichever way. We feel that these guides would be helpful in what are some of the ways that climate communications work best. So we have 4 top tips. I'll be sharing that in this quick 5-minute overview. So the first top tip is that climate leadership is a vote winner, as Nick said as well. It doesn't lose votes anymore. The top message that we see from our research is that politicians need to realize that don't slow down climate action, speed it up. If anything, the majority of people in UK want politicians to work together to make this happen. And when asked about the likelihood to vote for imaginary political parties based on net zero pledges, we see that people are more than twice as likely to think politicians should speed up. Our research from Britain Talks Climate also shows that 60% of the people would vote for a party that keeps or speeds up the pace of UK climate action. And it's only that 15% would vote for a party that would slow down. We also see that 62% of people think net zero is good for the UK, and only 10% think it's bad news. I'd love to go into the detail of the term net zero, perhaps during Q&A later, because our research has found some very simple yet fascinating insights into just using this term. So I won't spend my 5 minutes on this just yet. The second top tip that we have is that most people care about climate and nature. It is now normal to care about climate and nature. We are long past when this was a fringe group on the side that used to care about this. Don't forget that climate and nature crises are still the 4th highest priority for people in the UK, and for some much higher, of course, ahead of the general election. So when we do our research, we find that the idea of climate investment makes people feel happy and hopeful for the future. The third top tip is that people seeing is believing. So the more we get tangible, the more we get practical in the way that we talk about climate, that is useful. People are skeptical about big claims that things will be better in the future. So for saying that this transition would be better than all the previous ones, that does not work. We see that around the country, climate action is already creating jobs. It's already helping with energy bills. And it is not separate to what people want to see around them. It's connected to how we solve other issues, from better housing to better healthcare. And it is absolutely at the heart of it. So our takeaway is that climate is the story that is underpinning all the things that people look to for great examples of things that are happening around them. Where we can see good examples, especially in more local campaigning, it's useful to draw those out, and telling that story works great. The fourth point and the last point for good climate communications is empathize. We need to talk about how the transition must be fair. We find in our research that people think net zero will be good for the UK as a whole. But people on lower incomes especially worry about that they will be left behind to face the costs of the transition. And rightfully so. The worry is justified for a lot of them. We see that 51% of people think that expecting everyone to pay for low carbon tech themselves goes too far. So the takeaway here is that people want to feel that the whole of the society is putting in the effort for this transition. And they want to be taken seriously by the governments first and foremost. So those are the quick top tips, and perhaps we can go a little bit deeper into some of these points later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great, that's a really helpful overview, Namira, of some of your research, and yeah, as you say, flagged a few interesting issues that we should definitely come back to in the Q&A. Maybe Nick, if I can bring you in to perhaps sort of quickly answer a couple of the targeted questions that have come up in the chat from people about the polling. So there's one about whether you had any findings around Conservative to Lib Dem switches, and someone asking for a bit of background on the kind of methodology that went into the research. So do you want to sort of pick those two up, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So just on the methodology quickly, was keen not to bore everyone with too much of that, but essentially what we've got here is a representative sample of Conservative voters in 2019. So folk who voted for the Conservatives in 2019. So that's representative by region, age, gender, education. So it really is a kind of in miniature. So we asked 2,000 people these questions, a sample which is representative of basically what the addressable market of Conservative voters were thinking when we asked the questions, which was in April, so a little bit ago. And I think feel like that probably the framing hasn't changed that much since the election has been announced. Ultimately, those groups are the groups that have seemed to matter. On the sort of Labour reform point, I think that's been the core of what the campaign's really looked like. So it's been interesting to see that borne out. On Lib Dems, I think what we were keen to do is really focus in on the Labour and reform switchers. Obviously, the Lib Dems are going to matter a lot more in certain constituencies, but the kind of volume of the switchers isn't really as significant as those we're going to see, those that we saw from Reform and Labour. So in our sample, we saw 51% saying that we're going to still vote Tory, and then 18% Reform, 17% Labour. So that's getting us really close to almost all of the sample. And Lib Dems are slightly, I wouldn't want to lump them in with Labour, because obviously people vote Lib Dem on a number of issues, and it's not necessarily just a sort of progressive versus Tory thing. So we kind of left them out, but I'm sure there's lots of interesting stuff there to be dug into in future research.
Great, yeah, thanks, Nick. And I mean, yeah, I think there are quite a few different types of voter groups that it would be interested to do more studies into, like Conservative to Green switchers as well. I think are really sort of fascinating in this context, and obviously seeing a lot of those in places like Suffolk, for example. Nimir, if I can come to you with a kind of quick follow-up question from me, just to flag everyone, we've shared some of the resources from Climate Outreach in the chat. So please do go away and have a look at those. And the polling that Nick mentions, we have, as SEN, put out a press release with some of the top line findings on that. So if maybe one of my colleagues who's listening can share that in the chat as well. That sort of will give you some of the top lines, and we can potentially share more as well after that if there's any other points that people want to pick up on. But sorry, yeah, Namira, just to kind of come to you. I know with that piece of research you were talking about, the Britain Talks Climate Set, you sort of segment the British public into sort of different climate tribes with, you know, linked loosely to the party affiliation and sort of philosophical underpinning. What advice did you have for people on the call who are Conservative councillors, Conservative activists, about how can they have a positive conversation on the doorstep, specifically with Conservative voters? Are there differences or variations in some of the tips that you mentioned, specifically for kind of right-leaning audiences?
Thank you for asking that excellent question. So, as Nick mentioned, in their research, they find that energy security is a term that broadly works. We find in our research that the term balancing works, and I'll explain this a bit more. So we, during our research, wanted to look deeper into the term net zero. As we all know, it's such an established term. It's a useful shorthand for a breadth of climate action needed over the coming years. But if we actually face it, it's a very technical and a very boring term. Two things that are opposite of a great climate story that we all really need to be telling right now. The really technicality of the term allows it to be easily weaponized by people who want to make climate action out to be uncaring or distant from people's real concerns. So we went out to look at what are some of the other terms that might work across the political spectrum. And as you mentioned, in our Britain Talks climate research, we have 7 segments of people across a whole range of political and other affiliations. So we tested 3 terms to see sort of where people stand across the 7 segments. The first one was Britain ends its contribution to climate change. Throughout the 7 segments, it got like a lukewarm response. Then we tested Britain reaches net zero. Again, you know, for the progressive activists, it was 86% of people that agreed with it. But among the backbone conservatives or the disengaged traditionalists, it was around 37%. So still quite low. But then we tested our third statement, which is Britain balances the amount of carbon dioxide we release with the amount we remove from it. We found a whopping 92% from the progressive activists, which was, you know, expected. But we also saw 75% and 69% from the traditionalists and the loyal nationals and the sort of backbone conservatives. And those were high numbers. So what do we get from this? We understand that the most popular option talked about balancing, and this fits with our established findings that the idea of restoring balance to nature, the idea of restoring balance to the human's impact on the planet, all of this is appealing to people across segments, but in particular to those more right-leaning. We find that, so I currently live in the borough of Barnet, which is in North London. This borough is not traditionally known for its climate activism. But what I find absolutely fascinating is that the majority of people living in this borough deeply care about nature and the environment. So they care about the bee population and they care about sort of the flora and the fauna. And that's exactly what we see with the more right-leaning segments of society, that if we link climate with nature and we use similar language and terminologies, so instead, leave net zero, leave emissions, talk about air pollution, talk about warmer homes, talk about balancing, all of these words strike with the values that people hold and work so much better.
Great, thank you very much. Please do keep your questions coming in the chat, by the way. If you've got any further points you want to put to the panelists, yeah, we'll try and make time for them. Nick, if I can come to you next, and really sort of interested in sort of you expanding a little bit on some of on one of your points in your concluding remarks about the sort of Conservative strategy in this election. Obviously, the kind of polling suggests that further net zero rollbacks would be a mistake electorally, and the sort of message, the headline message that the party has adopted on net zero around proportionate pragmatic does land well with the voters, but certainly kind of reading a lot of and listening to what Conservative spokespeople have said in the debates and what the kind of media coverage of some of their energy interventions have been, it has been overwhelmingly focused on attacking kind of Labour's net zero policies and highlighting the costs of them. Do you think that as a strategy is working? And obviously not much is working at the moment based on the current polls, but as a sort of strategy for talking about climate and following some of the insights that you've said in the polling, do you think there's the right strategy, or should they have more of a kind of positive messaging on actually why net zero is important and potentially kind of contrasting with what Reform have been saying on that?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think obviously not to harp on this point for all of my time speaking, but the Conservatives are caught between a rock and a hard place in that they are at once trying to appeal to the voters who are switching to the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, essentially whoever the opponent is, in particular marginal, and also doing whatever they can to stem the flow of folk to Reform, which has kind of become a bit of a torrent ever since Nigel Farage came back into the fray. And so they are trying to do whatever they can to stop that from happening. But I think and again, I have no special insight into this in terms of what their strategy has been and how successful it's been, but trying to kind of cut a dividing line between the Conservatives' approach and the Labour Party's approach on climate has appeared to not be entirely successful. I think that the majority of the voting coalition is broadly in favour of action to try and combat climate change. They are supportive of investment in renewables. And I think the polling bears that out. And it's very easy to be distracted by a very vocal minority who are perhaps really activated against the idea of net zero. But it's very important to remember that this is a minority and ultimately isn't going to be the deciding factor in any election. And I think, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think if I were thinking about how to present the party's sort of policy set on climate, I would remember just how asymmetrical the issue set is for the different types of voters, right? So if you're trying to appeal to Reform voters, it's kind of not going to make any difference if you bang on about how much you hate net zero and that you think that the Labour Party is going to take away your car and make you install a heat pump that you hate and is really expensive. Those things matter to people, but ultimately it's not going to motivate any Reform voter to come out and vote for you if they can see Nigel Farage on TV saying it's been 3 years and there's been immigration of over 2 million. Like, that's the thing that you care about more than anything else. So it's a sort of a lost game, the idea that you can win over this set of supporters that you had in 2019 by talking about an issue which isn't a first or even a second order issue for them. It's like a third or a fourth order issue. It's just so far down their priority list that trying to use your climate policy, which can be a powerful way in which to show Labour switchers or Liberal Democrats or people who might vote for the Green Party in places like Suffolk, and I saw some people on the doorstep in Derbyshire who thought the same. It can be a powerful way in which you can show that actually you're in tune with their concerns. Using that to try and stem the Reform leakage is, I think, a tactical mistake. And ultimately, there is more to be done in pointing to the success that net zero has been in lots of ways, right? There's been lots of investment. We've been able to ramp up the sort of place for wind in our energy mix a great deal. Emissions are looking like in a better spot than we might have hoped. I think that there's a message that you can tell where actually you are talking positively about it. And I think some of Namira's points about exactly how you frame that message are going to be vital. And that's probably where I would suggest the party ought to be looking.
Great, thanks, Nick. That's a really helpful summary. Nimira, so coming to you, we've had a question in the chat about onshore winds. And I think, it might be worth us sort of spoken a lot about some of the national campaign themes and messages from the party. But we know that at a local level, some of the most controversial issues have been in the net zero space, like new pylons that are being put up to bring offshore wind power back onshore to population centres, or proposals for large new solar farms. What do you think the kind of best messages and narratives are to kind of local communities who have concerns about the impact of kind of net zero development? How do you kind of reassure people, bring them on side and so on, as part of some of these local campaigns?
Absolutely. Whatever the actual question would be, wind or pylons or whatever, it is critical to be trusted to talk about climate change or whichever issue. And gaining trust is a whole big sort of area that is often ignored. We find that if you show empathy in these conversations, so you show that this person, whoever is talking, understands that there are different perspectives, and sort of there are different worries that are genuine, that works. The second thing is there's passion. So if the people that you are speaking to at their doorstep are hugely passionate about a very small, seemingly small issue, that may not be in your party's manifesto, that you may not be prepared to talk about, you won't be able to connect with them. So showing passion to what other people care about is important. And then the third sort of tip is having credibility. You need to be able to show that what you're talking about. So for this, it helps just to sort of do research before on what are some of the hot climate related topics in your area, what great things are happening as part of the climate action locally, and your party's plans on public engagement, to give people a meaningful say. And just while all of this is happening, so again, whether it's wind or whether it's violence or whatever, try to focus on anything that is positive. We find that voters are and people generally do not vote on negativity. So if there are a lot of issues on a certain topic, just try to turn that around in some way. We find that people vote for the manifestos or for the pledges that offer a positive way forward. So a future where tomorrow is better than today, and innovation friendly net zero manifesto based on fairness, responsibility, and economic potential. So whatever the topic should be, it has to be pivoted in a way that we find positive stories to tell about it, would help.
Great, thanks so much, Namira. Nick, I'll sort of put a couple of those questions that have come in to you as well. I know you did some polling as part of this research on different energy sources and their popularity, which you might be able to draw from. But what do kind of voters think about, firstly, onshore wind and fracking? And I guess sort of related question to that, which again, I think there was something in the research on this as well, was how do voters sort of respond to politicians opposing local net zero developments? Is it something that generally benefits politicians, or is it something that kind of damages their perception? Because you do see a lot of polling that actually, despite this idea that a lot of people have that onshore wind is incredibly controversial, broadly speaking, large majorities of people do support it as a technology. Do the politicians perhaps sort of overestimate the opposition to some of these things?
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable point. And as you say, we included in our polling the sort of hypothetical scenario, imagining that your local MP was, there was a solar farm in your constituency. I think we framed it in quite a nice neutral way, and it showed that there wasn't really a dividend for MPs opposing sort of energy infrastructure development in the abstract. I think it's it's meaningful to acknowledge the fact that ultimately these are going to be contentious local issues, and especially in a campaign like this, which is a very strongly defensive campaign for many MPs, especially Conservative MPs, where the National Party is less than popular, let's say. People are going to lean on local issues a lot more, which is unsurprising, which means that you're going to get a lot of, well, candidates who used to be MPs who are going to lean on things like potential solar farm or a potential wind farm in their area, and that's going to be pretty important. So important to acknowledge that actually they are going to be controversial, but in terms of the connection with people's values, people in general are supportive of the idea of renewable investment in their area. I think, to me, it's a case of designing the mechanism of being able to allow them to be bought in, to see the benefits of any scheme, whether that's in terms of financial benefit or other sort of ameliorative schemes that can be brought into the community. That tends to be really important to showing that, you know, that the investor actually cares about what people think. So we've done a bunch of groups on similar topics, and that appears to be really, really important in getting buy-in. I think a very interesting piece, just very briefly on energy sources, is just how ideologically divergent these things can be. So something which I think is a bit of a nugget that I always stick to is that Reform voters are actually very enthusiastic about nuclear power. So if you're trying to sell the energy transition to a sort of a right-wing or perhaps a Reform curious Conservative, you should talk about small modular reactors. You should talk about the progress that the Conservative Party has made on investing in nuclear. Whereas for people who are voting for the Labour Party, it's actually more likely to be solar and wind. So actually, there are some interesting nuances in terms of their priorities by party affiliation, in terms of what they think is going to be the core part of the energy transition.
Yeah, that's when it's, yeah, definitely interesting to see in the Reform manifesto, they have a huge focus on nuclear and propose to sort of tax renewables to extinction. Although I do think with Conservative voters from 2019, generally still wind and solar come out on top, I think, in terms of sort of most popular energy sources. I think it is sort of slightly kind of counterintuitive, perhaps. But yeah, there's still those sources are very popular. Maybe we can have time for maybe one last question each. So Namir, I thought I might put to you the question around sort of levels of environmental awareness and like to what extent climate campaigners and political parties kind of need to do more to kind of inform voters about some of the different technologies that are available, some of the different opportunities that are available to tackle these problems. Is that kind of our big issue, and should that be the kind of main focus of climate communications, rather than trying to sell abstract targets or you know, sort of particular policies?
Yeah, no, excellent question. And I just got a chance to look at the chat as well. And this, what you're asking fits in perfectly what Sebastian and Josephine have also asked. We do think at Climate Outreach that the previous governments have not engaged with the public. So people may not necessarily be against so much of what we're talking about in terms of climate or environment or nature, but because the level of public engagement is so low, the minority vocal group is able to sort of take over the conversation. So at Climate Outreach and a host of other organizations that we work with, we have been calling for the government previously, and for the whichever new government comes to power, that we need a public engagement strategy at a national level for the whole of the country, funded by the government, and sort of involving all the stakeholders that are necessary, which lays out how to engage more people. So the first step of engaging people would actually be informing them. It would turn out that majority of the segments are not opposed to any of what the government has been trying to propose, but because they didn't have the whole information about it, they were more likely to sort of get drawn into social media circuits where they're only reading what the vocal minority has been putting out. So it's very, very important that the government has a public engagement strategy for climate change. And the other thing is, I think it relates to one of the questions in the chat as well, is that look for unifying topics. We don't need to be talking about the energy transition and sort of what is everyone supposed to be committing to reach net zero. We can talk about nature, how to balance nature, how to protect our nature, and these topics are generally across the segments more approachable. They they align with people's values as human beings. So it's about using better communications. And also we find that showing is better than just telling people. Disengaged groups are tired of big promises that things will be better. They want to see and feel that change is already happening and it's good, and people like them trust it. So don't talk about things like green jobs in the abstract. Instead, show how people are already thriving in carbon jobs, in low carbon jobs, in the towns and communities where your audience lives in.
Brilliant, thank you, Noel. Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Nick, sort of final question for you. Perhaps you might want to pick up on Josephine's comment in the chat about what sustainability topics are widely not agreed not to be controversial, rather. And I was sort of going to add a related question, which is, I know you've been doing some polling for other people during the course of the election campaign. What has really kind of emerged from the election campaign in terms of environmental policies or topics that has sort of cut through to voters, that has been popular? What has worked? And Labour's GB Energy seems to poll incredibly well and comes very high up kind of list of sort of top policies. But yeah, is there anything else that you would sort of pull out on that?
Yeah, so I suppose 2 points. The first is that the things that are really universally popular are things that feel cost-free to voters. So I mentioned it earlier, but you cannot overstate the extent to which this comes up in focus groups. Single-use plastics in supermarkets. People are incensed at the idea that this is a part of their lives. Ultimately, this is not going to be really a huge difference maker for tackling climate change, but it's visible to people and it seems like it's not going to come at any cost to them. Frankly, I think we should aim our sights a little bit higher than being able to tackle things like that. And policies necessarily come with trade-offs, but it's about, I think, very much building on Namira's sort of work on messaging. I think it's about being able to situate environmental policies as part of the things that people really care about, right? So we know that energy and the cost of living has been the absolute dominant issue for most voters over the past few years. And the idea of energy abundance, energy security, is going to be a hugely motivating factor for people. That's why, as you say, Labour's GB Energy appears to be directly addressing this, right? It's speaking to something that people really care about. It's framing what is essentially partly to do with sustainability and the energy transition in terms that actually matter to people. And that's why it's popular. And the more that we talk about, I suppose, terms that are either technical or dry or perhaps controversial, the more that we are going to make it less persuasive to people, but the more that we can link it to things that people actually care about, the better.
Brilliant. Well, we're at time now for the webinar. So yeah, it just remains for me to thank everyone who's joined us today for listening, for your time. I know it's very busy with the election campaign and lots of you are activists and will be out door knocking. So very grateful for you for taking some time away to listen to this webinar. And of course, a huge thank you as well to our 2 speakers, Nick and Namira, for your insights and for your contributions. Yeah, we're very grateful for your time as well. So thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Thanks.